How many of you have ever been bitter? Hands down. How many of you, when you look back at it later, you came to the conclusion that actually you kind of had it right? But it doesn't work. Because bitterness will hurt you and destroy you, whereas the person you're bitter at is relatively unaffected by your bitterness. And so this morning we're going to be looking at a story. It's a fascinating story, the story of Ahithophel. Now you may say, Ahithophel, I don't remember that name. Well, I preached on it about 2 or 3 years ago, so it may come back to you as I share. On the other hand, it may seem brand new to you because it certainly is not one of the most common stories in Scripture. But I want to begin by telling you a true story. A central part of the story of Ahithophel is espionage. And I want to start by telling you a true story of espionage from World War II. In late 1942, Operation Torch, which was the Allied invasion of North Africa, was getting close. And all the military leaders knew that to take Africa, the logical place to attack was Sicily. The Germans knew it. The English knew it. In fact, Churchill would on one occasion say, everybody but a bloody fool would know that we're going to attack Sicily next. But the upper parts of the English command came up with a plan called Operation Mincemeat. Anybody heard of Operation Mincemeat before? Can you check? We've got a whistle that's getting worse. Operation Mincemeat was a detailed plan to trick the Germans. They basically got a dead man, it was an alcoholic who had committed suicide, who had no family. They loaded his body and created a story. And they attached a folder to his right arm with a chain running down his sleeve, up under his clothing to his belt, and it was locked on. And then they dumped him in the water just off the coast of Spain, knowing at just the right time that the current would take him to land. And he looked legitimate. They created a Major Houghton, I believe was the gentleman's name. He really didn't ever exist, but there were several other people with William Martin, excuse me. William Martin, they created a story for him. They did a funeral for this man who had never existed. It was a very believable story. And to make a long story short, the Germans bought it hook, line, and sinker. Because what was in the satchel that was chained to his arm was incorrect battle plans, informing the Germans that actually they were not going to attack Sicily where everybody expected. They were actually going to come in from another location. It worked perfectly. The German forces shifted the main part of their armory to the point where they had discovered in this fake message that the English were going to attack, and they took soldiers and armament away from the very place the English were planning on attacking North Africa. So on D-Day, American, English, and other Allied deaths were much, much lower. The casualties were much lower because the Germans were expecting the attack elsewhere, and by the time they figured out they had been deceived, it was too late. Not only that, but there was actually a long-term side effect that the English had never anticipated. On D-Day, one of the things that happened is that some English leaders with actual legitimate intelligence papers were captured, but Hitler would no longer believe anything he discovered on the English. And so even though he had good intelligence on other occasions, he would no longer use it because he didn't trust it. Isn't that interesting? The world of espionage is just so foreign to most of us, but it's honestly a very significant part of any battle. If you would please, let's open our Bibles to 2 Samuel 17:1. And we're going to read the first 23 verses. This story that we're looking at takes place in the life of David, and David ruled about 1,000 years before Christ. The story focuses on one of David's closest advisors, a man named Ahithophel. Ahithophel was his most trusted confidant. And God had promised David, when he committed adultery with Bathsheba and then killed her husband Uriah, that tragedy would follow him the rest of his life. This is one of those stories. His son Absalom rebelled against him and tried to take the throne from his father. This is part of the story of what took place. 2 Samuel 17, let's begin reading with verse 1. Now Ahithophel urged Absalom, "Let me choose 12,000 men to start out after David tonight. I will catch up with him while he is weary and discouraged. He and his troops will panic and everyone will run away. Then I will kill only the king, and I will bring back all the people to you as a bride returns to her husband. After all, it is only one man's life that you seek. Then you will be at peace with all people." The plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. But then Absalom said, "Bring in Hushai the Archite. Let's see what he thinks about this." When Hushai arrived, Absalom told him what Ahithophel had said. Then he asked, "What is your opinion? Should we follow Ahithophel's advice? If not, what do you suggest?" Hushai replied to Absalom, "This time Ahithophel has made a mistake. You know your father and his men, and they are mighty warriors. Right now they are as enraged as a mother bear who's been robbed of her cubs. And remember that your father is an experienced man of war. He won't be spending the night among the troops. He's probably already hidden in some pit or cave. And when he comes out and attacks and a few of your men fall, then there will be panic among your troops, and the word will spread that Absalom's men are being slaughtered. Then even the bravest soldiers, though they have the heart of a lion, will be paralyzed with fear. For all Israel knows what a mighty warrior your father is and how courageous his men are. I recommend that you mobilize the entire army of Israel. Bring them from as far away as Dan in the north and Beersheba in the south. That way you will have an army as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And I advise you personally lead the troops. When we find David, we'll fall on him like dew that falls on the ground. Then neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. And if David were to escape into some town, you will have all Israel there at your command. Then we can take ropes and drag down the walls of the town into the nearest valley until every stone is torn down." Then Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "Hushai's advice is better than Ahithophel's." For the Lord had determined to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel, which really was the better plan, so he could bring disaster on Absalom. Hushai took Zadok and Abiathar, the priest, what Ahithophel had said to Absalom and the elders of Israel, and what he himself had advised instead. "Quick," he told them, "find David and urge him not to stay in the shadows of the Jordan River tonight. He must go across at once into the wilderness beyond, otherwise he will die and his entire army with him." Jonathan and Ahimaaz had been staying at Enrogel, so as not to be seen entering and leaving the city. Arrangements had been made for a servant girl to bring them the message they were to take to David. But a boy spotted them at Enrogel and told Absalom about it. So they quickly escaped to Behurim, where a man hid them down inside a well in his courtyard. The man's wife put a cloth over the top of the well and scattered grain on it to dry in the sun. So no one suspected they were there. When Absalom's men arrived, they asked her, "Have you seen Ahimaaz and Jonathan?" The woman replied, "They were here, but they crossed over the brook." Absalom's men looked for them without success and returned to Jerusalem. Then the two men crawled out of the well and hurried on to King David. "Quick," they told him, "cross the Jordan tonight." And they told him how Ahithophel had advised that he be captured and killed. So David and all the people went with him across the Jordan River during the night, and they were all on the other bank before dawn. When Ahithophel realized that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey, went to his hometown, set his affairs in order, and hanged himself. He died there and was buried in the family tomb. Would you pray with me, please? God, please open our hearts and minds to this incredible story and the truths that it contains. God, help us to learn from Ahithophel so that we do not repeat his foolish mistakes. In your name I ask these things. Amen. Here's where we're going to start. We can be both right and wrong. Have you ever had that experience? Where you were both right and wrong all at the same time? And it makes sense of what's going on here. Ahithophel was a superstar in the ancient world. He was so wise that according to 2 Samuel 16:23, Israel's leaders considered that when they got advice from him, it was as if you were hearing directly from God. Every time you talked to the man, he gave wise advice. If you really wanted to get the wisdom on a difficult situation, Ahithophel was your man. That's just the way it was. Unfortunately, in this section of the story, something has to be pointed out. Although Ahithophel is going to give proper advice, it's still going to be wrong. Because although he's incredibly wise, he makes a miscalculation in his judgment. Instead of supporting David, who he should have supported, he supports Absalom, David's son, in his rebellion. David's the legitimate king, and he's being challenged by his son. And instead of Ahithophel being wise enough to take the right side, he sees this as his chance to get back at David. Here's the next statement in your notes. It's possible to be smart and godly and still be wrong. We normally think somebody who is smart, and especially if somebody's godly, they're going to do the right thing. But sometimes you can be smart and godly and still make the wrong choice if your attitudes get in the way. Now, part of the story we're looking at here, Absalom's rebellion, has been so effective that David and his forces have literally had to abandon Jerusalem. They're running for their lives. And that sense of betrayal must have been terrible for David. And then Ahithophel, his most trusted advisor, comes along and says, here's what you need to do. Now, with his father on the run, Absalom asked Ahithophel, what should I do? And Ahithophel's advice is really good. He says, immediately follow David. Let me, Ahithophel says, follow David, and I will take a small group. We will slip in and we will kill the king. Once the king is killed, you will then be accepted as the new king of Israel. It was true. That's exactly what would have been. That's exactly what would have happened. But there was a problem. Ahithophel had some bad judgment. I want to show you something that you won't notice unless you read the passage carefully. And what I want you to look at is the first 3 verses. In the first 3 verses, there is really there's just an interesting emphasis if you see it. Read those verses with me, and I want to emphasize something that you won't see the first time you read it. Now, Ahithophel urged Absalom, what's the next word?
Me.
Let me choose 12,000 men to start it after David tonight. Verse 2, I will catch him while he is still weary, while he is weary and discouraged. He and his troops will panic, and every one will run away. Then I will kill only the king. Verse 3, and I will bring all the people back to you as a bride returns to her husband. Do you get the sense that Ahithophel wants this to be something that he personally does? Absolutely. And let me tell you why. Because it's not going to be real obvious at first glance. It's the reason why, although Ahithophel is smart and he is godly, he's actually making some remarkable mistakes. And the remarkable mistakes that he makes is his bitterness got in the way. You see, what I didn't tell you is if you look at the background of the story, guess who Ahithophel's granddaughter was? Bathsheba. David committed adultery with his granddaughter because he was the king. Most Bible scholars say she probably had no choice. And then what did David do to Bathsheba's husband? Was David wrong? 1000%. Absolutely no justification, no excuse. In fact, according to the typical rules in the law, David should have been killed. But God showed mercy. He showed mercy. He offered grace. But Ahithophel just couldn't accept that. He said, this is my granddaughter. That was my grandson-in-law. And so, he gives good advice, but he's in the wrong because he's on the wrong side. His desire to settle the score with his old boss causes him to use bad judgment. And this next statement really illustrates that point. When we have unresolved issues in our lives, we are prone to make foolish mistakes. Anybody ever done that? You had some unresolved anger in your life, some bitterness, and you made some bad decisions? I suspect at some point most of us have probably been there. We can understand how Ahithophel would be tempted to take revenge. It's very understandable. But remember what God said? Vengeance is mine, God said. I will repay. In other words, vengeance doesn't belong to us. You may be bitter and angry and see your chance to get revenge, but don't. It's not yours. That vengeance, revenge belongs to God. He can settle the score far more effectively than you and I. And that brings us to the second point. Here's the second observation I make. We can be at odds with God. Even though Ahithophel was a godly man, in this situation he was at odds with God because God was on David's side. And that's part of the problem here. God still wanted David to be on the throne. Ahithophel didn't want David on the throne. The trouble wasn't that Ahithophel was at odds with David. The trouble was that Ahithophel was ultimately at odds with God. Ahithophel probably knew that what he was doing wasn't right, but he still wanted to get even. David had been totally wrong. The affair was inexcusable. The murder of his grandson-in-law, there could be no excuse. And although Ahithophel was accustomed to speaking and having people trust everything he says, and his idea was good, the fact that he chose to work with Absalom was wrong. In 2 Samuel 15, we hear that when David heard about Ahithophel's defection, he asked God to turn his advice to foolishness. The advice Ahithophel gave was still wonderful, but God still undermined it. There's more than a little irony that after getting advice from Ahithophel, Absalom specifically asked for advice from Hushai. Hushai was the exact person David sent back to give bad advice. And that leads me to another observation that I want you to look at in your notes. You cannot ultimately succeed if you aren't on God's side. Now, I don't mean that you may not get ahead temporarily, but I'm talking eternally. You can't ultimately have a fulfilled life and an eternity with God if you're on the wrong side. It just doesn't work that way. In spite of the fact that Absalom seems to have all the obvious things going for him, he isn't going to win because he's not on God's side. His plan gave David time to regroup. Hushai's plan gave David time to regroup. Ahithophel's plan was absolutely spot on. And after Absalom and the other officials heard from Hushai, they all thought it was better, but were told why, because in verse 14, God had determined to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel, which really was the better counsel. So here's another observation. God is in control, even if it doesn't look like it. Now, after Ahithophel gave such good advice and David's running for his life, if you had been a betting person, the odds would have been on Absalom, not David. But God's ultimately going to win. As one scholar pointed out, the statement that God turned Ahithophel's advice into bad is actually the turning point of the story, because God had determined to defeat Ahithophel's wise advice. And that brings us to the third point this morning. Without God, we are headed for disaster. You may not see it, but it's the reality. When Hushai's advice is accepted, David's friend gets a message to the priests who are still committed to David. They pass the message along to an unnamed woman who agrees to get a message to David. And if Absalom found out, he might change his mind and decide to attack quickly, which would be disastrous. The messengers are almost captured, but they manage to get away, and they get their message to King David. Now, David quickly takes his troops across the Jordan River. He prepares for the battle that he knows is going to be fought on his terms. Ahithophel's advice was logical and it was good. Well, look at this next statement. It's possible to be logical and mostly right and still fail. Because this is not about just Ahithophel's advice. This is about God working for David. Part of what's so fascinating about Ahithophel is that when he realizes that his advice won't be followed, he goes home, he puts his affairs in order, and he takes his life. Let me tell you why he did that. Because Ahithophel was so wise, he could look ahead and see what was coming. He wasn't a prophet, he was just smart. He looks ahead and he sees Absalom is going to lose. David will survive. I will be executed for treason. And so, because he did not want that to happen, he quickly sets everything in order and he takes his own life. The irony of it is that Ahithophel was generally right on almost everything. But his bitterness undermined his ability to make a good decision. And the same thing happens for you and me. Let me just illustrate. How many of you have ever gotten mad and you said something really dumb? Saw a lot of hands and I saw a lot more smiles. We've all been there. It's likely Ahithophel realized at that point he was in a no-win situation. If David won, he would be executed as a traitor. If Absalom won, Hushai would become the primary advisor because Absalom had taken his advice. There was no winning the situation. Either way, things were not going to work out. And here's the big point that I want you to understand. Ultimate success comes from aligning ourselves with God. Ultimate failure comes from not being aligned with God. Let me be clear. I don't want you to hear what I'm saying is that if you want to be healthy, wealthy, wise, and never have any problems, you turn to God. You know why I'm not saying that? It's not true. If you are a Christian, if you follow God, you're still going to have hard times. I think the vast majority of us here this morning are trying to follow God. And because we're trying to follow God, it's wonderful that we always get along with our spouses. Our children always behave. It's just a perfect life. I mean, just wonderful. Well, truthfully, it is a wonderful life, but it's certainly not perfect, is it? And I don't want you to think that God says that if you follow Him, that your life will be perfect and you will never have problems, because if you have that attitude, you're going to be shocked. Because it doesn't work that way. But I am telling you, God ultimately wins. It doesn't mean there will not be bad times, because there will. If you don't believe it, just join Jeff in his class on Revelation. Let me tell you, there's bad things going to happen in the end times. There are some bad things happening now, are there not? Here's a statistic this week just related to all the political stuff that's going on right now. Anybody want to guess what percentage of the American population is disgusted with this election? 92, you're really close. It's 83%. What a mess. But God's still God.
Amen.
Okay? I don't know who will win Tuesday, but I do know who will be king at the end of the day. I don't know what all is going to happen, but I do know that God will remain God. That's the one thing I'm absolutely certain of. That is just the way things are. Now, as I bring everything to a conclusion, Ahithophel had so much going for him that it's hard to see what happened to him without feeling sorry for him. I mean, can't all of us relate? If some powerful person persuaded your daughter to have an affair because she couldn't say no, and then he killed her husband, how many of you would be mad enough that you'd want to take revenge? Absolutely. It would be the natural, normal response. But as much as we may be tempted to take matters into our own hands, that's not faith. That's self-centered. Let me tell you why. Let me illustrate, and we will conclude with this. Do you know what Ahithophel would have seen happen had he trusted God and let God take care of things? We've all agreed David did totally wrong, right? No question. Not only the adultery, but then the murder. It was all wrong. But who was the next king that followed David? It wasn't Absalom. Who followed David in the line for the throne? Solomon. Who was Solomon's father? David. Who was his mother? Bathsheba. If only Ahithophel had left it in God's hands, he would have discovered that the next king was his great-grandson. Nobody expected that, including Ahithophel. You see, the remarkable thing is that when we take God's rights and act on them as if they belong to us, we inevitably mess things up. Not ultimately for God's plan, but in our own life. You know, you may be justified. Can't all of us understand how Ahithophel would be bitter? Absolutely. Totally understandable. But if he had left things in God's hands, he would have had the privilege of seeing his great-grandson Solomon sit on the throne. But he missed it because he got bitter. Folks, I don't know if you are struggling with bitterness. I know probably some of us are, because there's enough people here. And honestly, I'm close enough with some of you in the congregation that I know you have dealt with some really terrible things from people who did some really terrible things to you. Okay? But I'm telling you, God is God. He can fight your battles for you in ways that you would never imagine. Let's conclude with prayer. God, thank you that even when we are wrong, if we will trust you, you will not only forgive us, but you will turn things around and accomplish good through bad times. God, thank you for each person who's here. Encourage us, help us to have faith and follow you. In your name I pray these things.